There is a cave in the Carmel Mountains of Israel carved into the white limestone hills above what is now the city of Haifa. 13,000 years ago, people gathered there. They carved deep stone mortars into the floor of the cave. They laid their dead to rest on beds of flowers. And then, as the evidence makes unmistakably clear, they brewed beer. Not because they were farmers, not because they had surplus grain and nothing better to do with it. They were hunter-gatherers, nomadic foragers without fixed villages or cultivated fields. And they were brewing beer for rituals held in honor of the dead. The discovery of that cave, and what the residues in those stone mortars reveal, is one of the most quietly stunning findings in modern archaeology. Because it does not just push back the history of alcohol by a few centuries. It obliterates one of the most basic assumptions we have ever made about why humans started drinking. Let's start at the very beginning. Not with the first cave brewery, not even with the first humans. Let's start 10 million years ago. With a single mutation in a single gene in a primate ancestor we never knew existed. Researchers at Santa Fe College, led by molecular archaeologist Matthew Kerrigan, reconstructed the evolutionary history of a digestive enzyme called ADH4, the first alcohol metabolizing enzyme to encounter ethanol after it is consumed. They traced this enzyme across 70 million years of primate evolution, working backwards through 28 living species to reconstruct what the enzyme looked like in our ancestors. What they found was extraordinary. For most of primate evolutionary history, the ADH4 enzyme was essentially useless against ethanol. It processed the molecule slowly and inefficiently. But roughly 10 million years ago, approximately when the ancestors of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas began descending from the trees and spending more time on the ground, a single mutation transformed the enzyme. Suddenly, it was 40 times more effective at metabolizing ethanol, 40 times. This was not an accident and it was not neutral. It was a selective advantage. The forest floor, as our ancestors moved onto it, was littered with fallen, overripe, fermenting fruit. Fruit containing alcohol. The creatures that could eat that fruit without getting sick or dying, without being rendered helpless in a landscape full of predators while their body tried to process something their chemistry was not built for. Those creatures had an edge. They could extract calories from a food source their competitors had to avoid. And so, the ability to metabolize alcohol was written into our genome 10 million years before we ever thought to deliberately ferment anything. This idea has a name. It was developed by UC Berkeley biologist Robert Dudley, and he calls it the Drunken monkey hypothesis. Dudley's argument is that our attraction to alcohol, the human pull toward fermented drinks that spans every culture ever studied, is not a quirk of modern civilization. It is an ancient primate reflex. For millions of years, our fruit-eating ancestors learned that the smell of ethanol was a signal. It meant ripe fruit. It meant caloric density. It meant energy when food was scarce. The scent of fermentation was not a warning, it was an invitation. A 2022 study published in Science Advances confirmed this directly. Researchers analyzed the fruit in the diet of wild chimpanzees at sites in Côte d'Ivoire and Uganda and found that ripe fruit pulp routinely contained measurable concentrations of ethanol, an average of roughly 0.3% alcohol by weight. Chimpanzees eat approximately 4.5 kilograms of fruit per day. The study calculated that this means wild chimpanzees are regularly ingesting the equivalent of roughly 1 to 1.5 standard drinks worth of alcohol every single day simply by eating their normal diet of ripe fruit. They are not getting drunk, but they are continuously exposed to ethanol. They have been continuously exposed to ethanol for millions of years, and so have we. Long before anyone brewed a single drop of anything, alcohol was already part of the primate experience, present in the food, metabolized by the body, linked in the brain with nutrition and reward, and the pleasure of eating well. Now let's come forward in time, because here's where the story starts to get strange in a way that most history books have never acknowledged. The dominant story of alcohol goes something like this. Humans invented farming around 12,000 years ago. Farming produced grain. Grain, left in water by accident, fermented. Someone tasted it. They liked it, and beer was born. This story is tidy. It is also almost certainly incomplete. In 2018, a team of archaeologists from Stanford University and the University of Haifa published findings from Raqefet Cave, that limestone burial site in the Carmel Mountains I described at the beginning of this video. The team, led by archaeologist Li Lu, analyzed 3 massive stone mortars carved into the floor of the cave. They found residues of wheat and barley starch that had been germinated, mashed, and fermented. The precise sequence of steps required to convert grain into beer. The mortars were dated to approximately 13,000 years ago. This is 5,000 years before farming began in that region, 5,000 years before the domestication of cereals, 5,000 years before the development of sedentary villages. The people who brewed beer in that cave were not farmers. They had no permanent settlement. They were semi-nomadic foragers. And they were brewing for ritual purposes, to honor the dead, to feast in the presence of the ancestors buried below their feet. As Li Lu put it, the discovery indicates that alcohol production was not necessarily a result of agricultural surplus. It was developed for ritual and spiritual needs, at least in part, before agriculture ever existed. This finding gave new life to a debate that had been rumbling in archaeology since the 1950s. A debate so counterintuitive and so quietly explosive that it changes how we understand the entire origin of civilization. The debate is known as the beer before bread hypothesis. It begins with a simple observation. The earliest domesticated cereals by wild emmer wheat, wild barley, the plants that would eventually become the foundation of agriculture, were not, in their original form, ideal for bread. They were difficult to process, low in yield, and unreliable in the quantities needed to feed a community. But they fermented easily. The same wet grain that produces a small, gummy, barely digestible porridge when cooked, produces intoxicating liquid when allowed to sit with wild yeast. What if the initial reason to begin managing wild grain, to return to the same patches year after year, to start selecting for particular traits? What if that reason was not bread? What if it was beer? At Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, the world's oldest known large-scale ceremonial site, built by hunter-gatherers 11,000 years ago without any evidence of agriculture, archaeologists have found enormous limestone troughs, some capable of holding hundreds of liters of liquid. Chemical analysis has detected oxalate residue on the walls of some of these vessels, a compound that forms specifically during the steeping, mashing, and fermentation of cereals, beer. People were apparently hauling wild grain from across a region, gathering by the hundreds at this stone monument that took enormous coordinated labor to build, and brewing beer to fuel the rituals. Oliver Dietrich of the German Archaeological Institute concluded that the production and consumption of alcoholic beverages was an important factor in the feast that facilitated social cohesion at Göbekli Tepe, and in organizing the collective work that built it. In other words, beer may have motivated the construction of the earliest known monument to human ambition. But what was that beer actually like? This is where the archaeology becomes vivid in a way that makes the ancient world suddenly unexpectedly close. The Natufian brew at Raqefet Cave was almost certainly a thick, murky, gruel-like substance. Low in alcohol, probably less than 2% by volume. Grainy, warm, slightly sour, full of sediment, nothing like any beer available today. 13,000 years after those stone mortars were first carved into the floor of that cave, a team of experimental archaeologists and brewers actually reconstructed the process, using the same species of wild grains the Natufians would have had access to. They malted the grain by germinating it in water, then drained, dried, and stored it. They mashed the malt and heated it. They left it to ferment with wild airborne yeast. The result was more of a fermented porridge than a drink, nutritious, caloric, psychoactive in mild but real ways. Not something you would drink to get intoxicated in the modern sense. Something you would drink at a feast in a ritual context among people who believed it connected them to something beyond the ordinary world. 9,000 years ago on the other side of the planet, something more refined was already taking shape. In the Yellow River Valley of China, at an early Neolithic village called Jiahu in what is now Henan province, people were making something different. Molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania analyzed the chemical residues inside pottery jars excavated at the site and found evidence of a mixed fermented beverage combining rice, honey, wild grapes, and hawthorn berries, brewed together into a single drink. This is currently the oldest chemically confirmed alcoholic beverage anywhere in the world. McGovern, who spent his career studying ancient fermented beverages and has been called the Indiana Jones of ancient ales and extreme beverages, has observed that just about every culture you can think of has a fermented beverage that is central to its social activity and religion. And he has been consistently surprised that this is not treated as more central to the study of human history, because the pattern, once you see it, is impossible to ignore. China 9,000 years ago, Israel 13,000 years ago, the Zagros mountains of Iran 5,000 years ago, where chemical analysis of pottery at the ancient site of Göbekli Tepe revealed the earliest confirmed barley beer in the Middle East, South America, Australia. The Americas before European contact, every inhabited continent, every major cultural tradition that has ever been studied. Fermented beverages appear everywhere independently, made from whatever the local ecology provided. Rice in Asia, grapes in the Caucasus, agave in Mexico, kava root in the Pacific, fermented honey wherever bees existed. As Patrick McGovern put it, the universality of fermented beverages across human cultures is not a coincidence. It reflects something deep and old about what alcohol has meant to our species. So what did it mean? Why did every culture independently arrive at the same discovery? What was alcohol actually doing for the people who made and consumed it? The nutritional case is real but limited. Ancient beer, thick, unfiltered, full of live yeast and B vitamins, was genuinely nutritious. It was safer to drink than water drawn from rivers and canals contaminated by human and animal waste. When workers built the great Ziggurats of Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, they were paid partly in beer, roughly 1 3/4 liters per day for ordinary laborers, with senior officials receiving 5 times that amount. One of the oldest known pieces of writing in the world, a clay tablet found at Uruk, and now in the British Museum, records the distribution of beer rations with pictographic symbols. A human head eating from a bowl meaning ration. A conical vessel meaning beer. That beer was food. It was caloric currency. But food alone does not explain why the Natufians brewed beer in a burial cave. It does not explain why Göbekli Tepe's stone troughs were apparently filled for ritual gatherings. It does not explain why the Sumerians had a goddess specifically devoted to brewing, Ninkasi, whose name translates roughly as the one who fills the mouth, and whose hymn, recorded on clay tablets around 1800 BCE, is simultaneously a prayer and a brewing guide. There is something else going on. And science has recently started to close in on what it is. Oxford University evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has spent years studying the social function of alcohol across human cultures, and his conclusion is pointed. Alcohol triggers the endorphin system, the same system activated by laughter, by singing, by dancing, by the kind of synchronized physical activity that binds groups of people together into something that feels larger than any individual. As Dunbar puts it, alcohol's role appears to be in triggering the endorphin system, which promotes social bonding. Endorphins are not merely painkillers, they are the chemical substrate of social attachment, the neurological glue of friendship, trust, and the willingness to cooperate with other people. And here's the critical point. 12,000 years ago, as humans were beginning to form the first permanent settlements, the most immediate problem was not food. The most immediate problem was people, strangers. People from neighboring bands who spoke slightly different languages, who had different customs, who could not be automatically trusted. How do you build a community with people you have never met? How do you negotiate, cooperate, share labor and food and risk with individuals whose intentions you cannot know? Alcohol in small doses in a shared ritual context temporarily reduces the social inhibitions that make strangers dangerous. It triggers the endorphin system. It makes people feel warm toward the people they are drinking with. And it does this not just in individuals, but in groups and by simultaneously, synchronously, in a way that few other experiences can replicate. A cross-cultural analysis of 186 non-industrial societies published in 2025 found a consistent positive relationship between the presence of traditional fermented beverages and higher levels of political complexity. Societies with fermented drinks built more complex social structures. The researchers' own language is careful about causation. But the pattern is consistent and global. Let's bring this all together because the full arc of this story is genuinely extraordinary. 10 million years ago, a mutation in a single gene made a primate ancestor 40 times better at metabolizing fermented fruit. Not because that ancestor was looking for intoxication, but because fermented fruit was food, and the ability to eat it without dying was a survival advantage. That mutation is still in your body right now. 13,000 years ago, long before farming began, hunter-gatherers in what is now Israel were brewing wheat and barley in stone mortars inside a burial cave. Not because they had surplus grain, but because alcohol played a role in ritual, in honoring the dead, in the ceremonies through which a community maintained its connection to something beyond the visible world. 11,000 years ago, at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, hunter-gatherers may have been brewing beer to fuel the communal gatherings that made it possible to build the world's first monumental architecture. The desire for the drink possibly motivating the transition to agriculture that would eventually transform the entire species. 9,000 years ago in China, a mixed fermented drink made of rice, honey, and wild fruit was already being produced in ceramic jars. Evidence that the discovery of fermentation was not a single event in a single place, but a threshold that human beings crossed independently on every inhabited continent using whatever the local ecology provided. And woven through all of it, from the Natufian cave brewery to the Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi to the trough-sized vessels of Göbekli Tepe, the same pattern. Fermented drink and ritual, fermented drink and community, fermented drink and the sacred. Not because early humans were looking for a way to get drunk, but because alcohol in small doses in shared ceremony does something to the human nervous system that almost nothing else can replicate. It opens the gates of the endorphin system and makes the people in the room feel, however briefly, like something more than strangers. The gene that made it possible has been in our bodies for 10 million years. The desire to ferment has existed for at least 13,000. And the need it answers, the need to trust, to cooperate, to bond across the distances between separate people, that need is older than either of them. The next time you drink something fermented, you are participating in a ritual that predates agriculture, predates writing, predates civilization itself. You are repeating a gesture first made 13,000 years ago in a limestone cave above the Mediterranean by people who were burying their dead and trying to feel for a few hours that they were not alone in the world. That is not a metaphor. That is archaeology. If this kind of deep history changes how you see the present, subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and keep watching.